This, take a look, is 21-year-old Elisa Lam.
Elisa Lam was said to be traveling to Santa Cruz.
The Canadian tourist was traveling alone on January 28th.
Gruesome find, very perplexing mystery here. What more do we know about this case?
It should have been a dream trip. Traveling the West Coast to LA and then to Santa Cruz would be viewed as a blessing for practically anyone. And that's exactly how 21-year-old Elisa Lam felt when her parents gave her permission to go. It wasn't easy to convince her strict parents to allow her to go on such a trip alone. But she gained their approval with one condition, that she would call home every night to assure her parents that she was okay. So, that's what Elisa did. Day one, she called home after reaching the Cecil Hotel, and she called home the second and third days as well. But Lam's phone call home on the fourth day of her trip would be the last time that her parents would ever hear from her. It was the start of February 2013 now, and days had gone by without anyone hearing from Elisa. To make things stranger, Elisa was supposed to have left LA at this point and should have been in Santa Cruz for the last leg of her trip. But strangely, Elisa hadn't checked out of her room at the Cecil Hotel. Due to this, police were notified and an official investigation was soon underway. Upon searching her room, police found most of Lam's belongings, and there was no sign of a struggle. They searched all the hotel rooms that they legally could, as well as the surrounding area of the hotel and the roof, but they found nothing. Elisa Lam had vanished. After doing some initial investigation, police discovered something strange. When Elisa had booked her room at the Cecil Hotel, she actually booked a shared room. The shared room was a way for her and her randomly selected roommates to save money. However, this arrangement didn't last long. Elisa's roommates quickly became concerned by her, quote, certain odd behavior, and they wanted her out. The hotel obliged and ended up giving Elisa her own hotel room. Now this is as specific as this detail gets, but as this case progresses, this detail would become more and more important. With no leads and the hotel being thoroughly combed over, nearly 2 weeks would go by with no forward movement on the case, and her parents began to grow more and more concerned that she may never be found. But a massive break in the case was coming. On February 14th, the LAPD released surveillance video of Elisa inside of an elevator at the Hotel Cecil. In this video, she is seen getting into the elevator and strangely hitting every single button to every floor. She then steps back in the corner and waits. She appears calm, but this doesn't last long. It seems as though Elisa is scared and hiding from something. As she steps out of the elevator, she appears disheveled and is clearly on edge. She then tries pressing all of the buttons on the elevator again, and the strange behavior continues from there. The elevator door opens and shuts a few times randomly, but Elisa is not captured on camera at any other point after this. This footage is dark and obviously very strange, and many have offered theories as to what was actually going on with Elisa at this time. But before we go over those, it is important to know the rest of Elisa's story. This footage proved to be a big break for investigators, as it clued them into the fact that Elisa mentally was not right at the time of her disappearance. But strangely, this supposedly was the only camera that had captured Elisa that night, which that alone is shocking considering how big this hotel was. But because of this, police still had no idea where Elisa had gone. To them, Elisa could still be in the hotel, or she could be 1,000 miles away by now. As the investigation slowed yet again, operation at the Cecil Hotel carried on as normal, but guests were beginning to complain about a seemingly ongoing and growing issue. The water pressure in people's showers seemed to be extremely low, and for some guests, the water was coming out discolored, and in some cases even black. Also, those who drank the tap water and used it to brush their teeth complained about a strange taste in the water. It was clear that the hotel was having a malfunction with their water tanks, and a repairman was sent up to address the issue. Santiago Lopez was the man tasked with this duty, and he figured the problem would be an easy fix. But as he reached the roof and opened the latch of one of the water tanks, Lopez was shocked by what he saw. Floating inside of the giant water tank was Elisa Lam's lifeless, decaying body. Over the past 19 days, residents at the hotel had been showering in water that Elisa Lam's body had been floating in. Many had drank the water too, which explains why guests complained of poor taste and why the water was coming out discolored. This disturbing note aside, what was even more disturbing was the notion of how Lam could have even ended up in the water tank in the first place. Because of the state that Elisa's body was found in, and the fact that it had started to severely decompose in the water, investigators were not able to do a complete and full autopsy. But despite this, they came to the conclusion that Elisa had entered the tank by herself and accidentally drowned. Which, yes, this is another accidental drowning, which is just a weird coincidence after my last video. And with the conclusion of accidental drowning, Elisa Lam's case was officially closed. But so many questions still remain. What was happening during the footage taken of Elisa in the elevator? And how could she have ended up not only on the hotel's roof, but inside of its giant water tank? The idea that Elisa Lam was murdered is a very interesting one. For starters, in the surveillance footage, it appears that Lam was hiding from someone and trying to escape. Perhaps someone was inside of the hotel and was hunting her down. In this particular theory, it would make the most sense if her murderer was an employee of the hotel. Think about it. This would explain why no other security footage captured her in the hotel prior to her death. An LA hotel in that area would almost have to be covered with cameras, but maybe the employee erased the tapes, or he knew a route that he could take without her being picked up by cameras. Also, this would explain how she got access to the roof and how she got into such a giant water tank. Another indication of this was also found during the investigation. Police dogs were brought into the scene to see if they could locate Elisa before her body was found. They sniffed the entire hotel and the majority of the roof, but had never caught a trace of her. Perhaps this is an indication that someone covered their tracks and cleaned their trail up, and this wouldn't have looked suspicious because they would literally be an employee. And there's another thing that people frequently point to when discussing the murder theory, and that has to do with the elevator itself. Something very clearly isn't right with this elevator, and it's easy to miss at first. The entire time that Elisa is in and out of the elevator, pressing all of its buttons, the door doesn't close once. It remains open for 3 straight minutes, which is not something that normally happens on an elevator, especially once a button has been pressed. And at one point, the elevator starts to close slightly and then immediately opens up, despite the fact that she wasn't in the doorway to trigger the sensor. This makes very little sense, but could be an indication that an employee of the hotel was manipulating the elevator and toying with her before they eventually killed her. If this is true, then it would appear that this would have been a sick game that this murderer was playing with Elisa, which is an absolutely horrifying thought. While watching this footage and doing more research, it also appears that the video skips forward at some points, and some claim that a full minute of recording was removed from the footage. Also, it seems that Elisa does in fact speak at certain points of the recording, but people claim that her mouth appears extra pixelated when she does so that you can't decipher the words that she was saying. Again, this could be a sign of editing, and who better to do this than an employee of the hotel who would have had access to the tapes, along with more than enough time to make the edits. Despite this being a strong theory, it is worth noting that the murder would not necessarily have to be an employee. It just helps the case. The Cecil Hotel was centered in a pretty seedy part of town, and the day before Elisa had passed away, she made a blog post stating that, "I'm going out tonight. I really hope no creeper comes near me. Seriously though, those Italian and Mexican guys go after you strong, show the slightest inclination, and they hound you," which, yikes, but this post could have been an indication that someone was coming onto her and creeping on her. Maybe they eventually murdered her. An indication of this could be the fact that Elisa's phone was never found. It wasn't in her hotel room, and it wasn't with her in the water tank where she was discovered. This detail becomes even more strange when multiple posts were shared on her blog after Lam had already perished. This could point to the idea that Lam was not only murdered, but robbed of some of her belongings that she had on her at the time. But with all this being said, it's worth noting that Lam may have just timed these posts to go live at a certain time before she died. And also, when it came to the condition of her body, there was no signs of physical trauma, which does cast some doubt on this theory. Our next theory, and undoubtedly the creepiest, deals with the paranormal. The Cecil Hotel has one of the darkest histories of any hotel that I've ever heard of. Much to my surprise, this is actually the same hotel in which the Black Dahlia had vanished from decades ago. Also, serial killers Richard Ramirez and Jack Unterweger both called this hotel their home at certain points. Along with this, a violent murder was committed there in 1964, and there have been 15 confirmed suicides at the hotel since its opening. Because of this, many believers in the paranormal state that the Cecil Hotel is incredibly haunted. But what does this have to do with Elisa's death? Well, when the footage of Lam in the elevator was first published, many noticed that it almost looked as if she was playing the elevator game. For those who don't know, the elevator game is a ritualistic game that supposedly takes you to another dimension. To play this game, you need an elevator that goes up at least 10 floors. You then follow a complex set of rules until eventually a woman walks into the elevator. She will ask you where you're going, but you must not look at her or speak to her. The elevator will then go down to the first floor, and you will be transported to another world, one where you were the only one present. Now, this game has always creeped me out, even if I don't necessarily believe it. And the scariest part is the fact that apparently one small mistake in this ritual can lead to serious consequences. And perhaps this is what happened to Elisa Lam. Maybe she had been playing the elevator game, and things went horribly wrong, as she made an error while performing the ritual. This would explain why it looked as if she was running and hiding from something that we couldn't see. Perhaps this was some sort of paranormal entity that only she could see at the time. This could explain why the elevator began to close and then quickly opened again as if someone was standing there, because maybe something was standing there. All in all, this theory is certainly out there, but it would explain why this case is so unexplainable. I mean, maybe this really was a case of the elevator game gone wrong. Now, there's one more thing that I want to add to this before I give the final theory and my personal opinion on what happened, but I don't really know what it means or how it fits in with anything, and at the end of the day, this is basically just a weird fact about this case. In the time that Elisa Lam had perished at the Cecil Hotel, a deadly outbreak of tuberculosis was ravaging the surrounding area. Now you may be wondering, okay, what is so significant about that? Well, those who showed symptoms were then administered a test to see if they truly had tuberculosis or not. This test had been around since 2009, so 4 years before this event. But guess what the name of this test was? Lam Elisa. Like, what? I mean, like I said, I don't know what this means, and it definitely means nothing, but that is such a strange and crazy coincidence, right? Okay, sorry, I just had to throw that in there. Now let's get on with the final theory. Our final theory is that officials in this case actually got it right. Well, that's the first time I said that on this channel. Elisa very clearly had a history with mental illness. and had been diagnosed with both depression and bipolar disorder. To cope with this, Elisa took 4 separate prescriptions to manage her symptoms. Though a full autopsy was not able to be done, it was discovered by testing her blood that she had not been taking her medication properly at the time that she had died. Perhaps this caused her to hallucinate and act strange, thus explaining her actions in the elevator and why she was placed into another room without roommates. And based off of her toxicology report, it seemed that Lam may have been suffering from a mental breakdown whilst she was in the elevator. So though this elevator footage seems extremely unnatural, the truth is that she was likely just having a breakdown. I mean, the misuse of her medication, coupled with her mental disorders, could have caused her to imagine that someone was chasing her or that something was out there. And with bipolar disorder specifically, this would explain why she frantically goes from calm to panicked in the 4-minute span. But this theory comes with one glaring issue. How did she end up in the water tank? Well, in order to access the roof, she would have needed to go through a locked door that only employees had the passcode to. If she even tried to force the door open, then an alarm would have been set off and she would have been caught. So getting up there alone through this door seems extremely unlikely. But then there's the issue of getting into the water tank. Employees used ladders to look into the tank and to work on the tanks, and it was confirmed that none had ladders propped up against them, meaning that Elisa did not use one to get inside. Also, the hatch on the tank was closed when Santiago Lopez discovered Elisa's body. So how could she have closed it after she had fallen in? Her even making it into the tank would have been difficult enough, but once she had fallen in, she would have had no way to shut that hatch. Now these facts alone seem to completely discredit this theory, but upon doing some research, I found this video which shows someone getting onto the roof of the Cecil Hotel without triggering any alarms, and they were able to do so by going out the fire escape and climbing a ladder to the roof. This video proves that Lam could have gotten to the roof undetected that night, and it also shows us that the hatches on the water tanks were sometimes left opened, meaning that Lam could have jumped onto the tank and either purposefully or accidentally fallen in. I'm still unsure of how she was able to close the door behind her, but at this point I would not be surprised if maybe this was just a mistake on the initial report. And as for her missing phone, she actually posted a blog post days before her death, telling her followers that she had misplaced it. There is no evidence to suggest that she found it after that, so presumably she would not have had a phone on her at the time of her death. Now personally, here's what I think happened. I think she used the fire escape to get onto the roof of the hotel that night. I mean, she frequently took pictures from rooftops of other hotels, so getting up there would have been entirely possible for her. Now, along with this, I believe that her misuse of medication was causing her to hallucinate, and I believe that she genuinely thought that someone was chasing her. Now, once up there, then maybe she climbed onto the taller roof and from there jumped on top of the water tank. And then, in an attempt to hide from her non-existent threat, she jumped inside the water tank and drowned. When her body was discovered, perhaps the employee had simply just stated that the hatch was closed behind her in order to avoid the fact that they were frequently left open. Doing this would absolve the hotel of some liability, and I actually think that the hotel pushed the narrative that it would have been practically impossible for her to get onto the roof in order for them to avoid even more liability, because in reality, anyone could have accessed the roof that day. I mean, sure, there are cracks and there are plenty of unanswered questions, and I still have my suspicions of a possible murder, but with the evidence provided, I'm content with the conclusion that this case may not have been as dark as many of us originally thought. But regardless of what happened that night, the case of Elisa Lam is one that has kept many of us up at night, and it is one that has left a lasting impact on our world's imagination.